Hello, and welcome to the Political Opinions Podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover the different approaches to international aid regarding both giving it and receiving it. Aid is a contentious topic, with some viewing it as essential to helping the developing world, others viewing it as a means to maintaining dependency for the developing world on the developed world, some say it is too expensive for the developed world, and so on. Whether or not a country should give aid is divisive, just as the benefits aid actually brings to a recipient country is divisive, and as such it is important to remind you that the aim of this episode is not to try and argue for or against aid, but rather to provide both points of view and offer a comparison between them. And while there are many different forms of aid, the term here will be used in a general sense, but may delve into more detail on some points. I will split both the arguments in favour and opposed to aid into subgroups of receiving and sending aid. But with that being said, the first section will cover the arguments that aid is good, followed by the arguments that aid is bad, with a comparison at the end. One of the main arguments in favour of countries sending aid revolves around the morality of it. To some people, richer countries have a moral responsibility to send aid to those countries which are just not as well off. Just as a socialist would advocate for wealth redistribution in an economy, so too would the people who see aid as a moral obligation believe richer countries have an obligation to send aid to less fortunate countries. Another argument in favour of aid is that more richer countries is better for everyone. This was an idea put forward by the economist John Maynard Keynes, who advocated for global wealth redistribution on the basis that if rich countries were relatively less rich than poorer countries because the poorer countries became richer, the total wealth of the world would be greater. Therefore, sending aid to poorer countries allows them to develop and means that the sender will, in future, have a richer country both to trade with and be on better terms with. Another benefit to the donor country is that its global reputation is boosted by sending aid. Just as many African countries have shifted their alignment from the USA to China over the last few decades, so too goes the idea that through sending aid to countries, both the other countries will think more highly of you, and it means that you will have a better standing with the countries who receive your aid. An argument coming from the viewpoint of history would also advocate that most globally developed countries only got to where they were through the exploitation of poorer countries, meaning they remained poor, and as such there is an obligation to help repay the debt through offering them aid. Their wealth comes in part from poor nations, and as such some of that wealth should be shared with the less fortunate nations. On the idea of receiving aid being good, aid doesn't require repayment. That's the whole point of aid. It's not a loan and it's not trade. And as such, it is better for poorer countries to receive aid because they can spend the money or resources they have without the fear and without holding back because they will have to pay it back in the future. If they know that they're going to have massive debts in the future, they may refrain from asking for it and from spending anything they get because they don't want to be in such high debt. But having the money or whatever it is without having to pay it back allows them to do what is necessary without any fear. Some also criticise the approach of the Washington Consensus, which essentially ran from just after World War II to around the 1980s and 90s, and essentially this idea advocated for free trade over aid. Some argue this led to weaker economies being dependent on nascent industries that will never develop, such as plants and natural resources, and they're dependent on the price of exports, which is why their economies fluctuate so much and they stay poor. So aid is needed to provide a boost to the economic situations of these countries and allow them to start actually developing. Many people in these countries also live in absolute poverty, with little access to water, shelter, food and healthcare, and as such, there is a need for material aid to be sent to provide help to these people. Be it a UN campaign to eradicate AIDS, or US food shipments sent into Somalia, some aid can help the people of these countries and therefore it should be sent. Finally, some would argue that even though these countries are corrupt and unpeaceful, it doesn't mean that the people of these countries should be left to suffer. Therefore, aid should be sent to the people in order to help them escape a situation which they didn't cause and don't deserve to be in. Essentially, this argument goes that these people didn't have to be where they are, and even if these countries are corrupt, it's not the fault of the individual people who suffer as a result, and therefore they should receive aid and not just be left to die, essentially. Pretty morbid, I know. Anyway, moving on to the idea that aid is bad. Regarding the idea of sending aid, aid is expensive and often results in countries being less able to spend money on what they may need. For example, the UK in 2019 spent £15 billion on aid, which is with a B and a very big number. And some would argue that this money could have been better spent elsewhere. Most Western countries in particular are very high in debt and are facing fiscal problems, and so aid shouldn't be sent if it comes at the cost of the people. Essentially, there's this idea that why should the UK have £15 billion less to spend on its own country when it's giving it abroad? And the biggest criticism for the UK aid in particular is the fact that a lot of it goes to India. India is in fact the largest receiver of UK aid, and yet India has a space programme and the UK doesn't. So why should the UK send money to India when they clearly don't spend enough on their own people? Moving on from this, a realist standpoint is essentially that if countries don't look after themselves first, they may neglect important things, which could come at a great cost. Be it spending less money on healthcare, the army, or education. Spending too much money on aid, and when you can't afford other areas, could be seen as a misselection of priorities for a nation. Many countries aid goes to are also not peaceful and require further spending to ensure the aid actually reaches where it's meant to go. This just adds to the further costs inflicted on the donor country. The best example of this is in Somalia, where US troops were sent in to try and help establish aid routes and provide aid to the country and essentially calm everything down. And if you've ever seen the film Black Hawk Down, you know that it didn't go too well, let's just put it that way. And finally, aid can be seen as giving donor countries control over a smaller economy. Now, I've put this in the negative because essentially on the wider viewpoint it's seen as bad, essentially, that countries are using this aid not because they want to help countries, but rather because they want to gain some sort of leverage over them for reasons I will just go into now. Regarding receiving aid being bad, some say that aid doesn't even reach the intended target, which in the most case does seem to be true. Again, back in Somalia in the 1990s, US aid often found itself in the hands of warlords, meaning that it gave them more power by controlling the aid. Therefore, aid is pointless because it doesn't reach the people it's intended for, and reaches those who in fact cause the need for aid in the first place. The warlords caused the civil war which led to aid being required, and yet the aid was only providing more power to the warlords by giving them control over food. Aid also allows countries with poor leaders who are corrupt to continue to curb responsibility. If they are aware that they will receive aid, they won't need to focus as much on their own government spending, as the aid will most likely cover it. This allows many receivers to continue to operate with corruption and inefficiency while avoiding responsibility, meaning their people suffer even more. Aid can also make countries dependent on it. If they are relying on aid to feed, educate and care for their citizens, a state may not know what to do if the aid is cut off. If the entire country is operated through aid, it prevents states adapting to meet the needs of their citizens and leads to dependency. Free trade would also be better for some people, the argument goes. Essentially, there's this idea that if the government and local economies are dependent on aid, then it prevents them from developing. You'll never have a functioning economy if it's entirely dependent upon aid, and therefore some would argue it is bad, and that it should be replaced with free trade. Moving on now to a comparison. Regarding the idea of a historical obligation, those in favour would say, well, you got rich off these countries, and because of you they are arguably poor, and therefore you have a responsibility to give something back and give them aid. Well, those on the other side would say essentially that we didn't cause it. We were born 200 years after the fact, so why should our lives be harmed through less money being spent on our own country than being given to other countries which we had no cause in because we weren't alive at the time? Then on the moral obligation, those in favour would just simply say that states do have a moral obligation to help poor nations, therefore it should be done. While those on the other side would say essentially that moral obligations shouldn't come over the needs of the donor country, that pragmatism should come first. If a country can't afford it, it doesn't matter what the moral need is, it should be relegated to a less importance. Regarding the idea that a richer world equals better for everyone, those in favour would say that helping other states get richer through aid will benefit them in the long run, while those on the other side would say, why help poorer countries get richer at our expense and then hurt our long-term competitiveness with them? Essentially this idea of us versus them instead of a collective global economy, essentially. On the idea of global reputation, Those in favour would say that aid makes countries look better and improves relations with poorer countries. Those on the other side would say that aid is done to help richer countries and have negative aims, not the altruistic ones some would associate with aid. Regarding the idea of the cost of aid, those in favour would say that Western countries can afford it. The UK, for example, gives 2% of its GDP, or its tax. I'm not entirely sure which one it is, but it gives 2% of something, which is a small number. So even 15 billion is big in relation to the total number. It's quite small, and as such, they would say that it can be afforded, while others on the other side would say that why reduce the amount of money you spend on your own country and send it to somewhere else? You should put your own nation first. On the idea of free trade, this is probably the biggest one in regards to aid. Essentially, there's this idea that free trade to people who support aid arguably stifles growth and only benefits the richer country, and therefore aid is better. While the other side would say that aid doesn't benefit the recipient but may benefit the donor country, but free trade would benefit both of them and allows long-term growth while aid doesn't. Aid should be only short-term, and the long-term, the free market and free trade is what allows development. On the idea of dependency, those in favour would say that, of aid rather, would say that states don't become dependent if aid is done right and shouldn't be done forever, whereas on the other side would say that looking at the examples, aid is very rarely done right and is almost always leading to dependency and can also cause corruption and more problems with that. And finally, the idea of who gets the aid, those in favour of giving aid would say that even if only a small percentage reaches those who need it, that's better than sending none at all. Whereas on the other side would say that aid only benefits those who cause the problems to begin with and is actually, in most cases, counterproductive. Overall, though opposing aid claim it doesn't help those it's meant to, causes more problems than it solves, and is either too costly for a nation or only done to help it, while those who support aid, however, would say that there is a moral obligation and it does help people. Essentially, the question just comes down to how much a country or individual believes in the power of free trade over aid. Ultimately, though, what do you think on this topic? And is there anything that I missed, got wrong, or could do better? And also, are there any topics you want to see? Let me know on Twitter or in the comments. And be sure to check back on Friday for another episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.